"Leave the recorder running," the calm voice said, steady enough to make the young officer hesitate for the briefest moment before reaching toward the patrol car. Officer Ryan Carter barely acknowledged the request. To him, it sounded like one more line from someone trying to sound confident after being caught. The late afternoon sun stretched across a quiet suburban road just outside Washington, District of Columbia, where traffic moved slowly beneath rows of maple trees beginning to glow with early autumn color. A silver sedan rested safely on the shoulder, while red and blue lights reflected across its windshield in rhythmic flashes. Several passing drivers slowed their vehicles, curious enough to glance at the unusual scene before continuing home. The man standing beside the sedan looked remarkably ordinary. He wore a navy windbreaker over a light blue button-down shirt, dark slacks, and comfortable brown shoes that had clearly seen years of careful use. His posture remained relaxed, his hands visible, and his voice carried neither fear nor anger. He simply watched Officer Carter with quiet attention, as though he believed patience still had the power to change what happened next. Carter, however, had already reached his conclusion. He believed the driver was refusing to cooperate, questioning routine instructions, and attempting to challenge his authority. "Step over here," Carter instructed firmly. The man complied without hesitation, moving exactly where he was asked before speaking again in the same measured tone. "Officer, before we continue, would you please explain the legal basis for what you are about to do?" Carter sighed impatiently. "You can ask questions later." The man nodded politely. "I understand. I would simply appreciate understanding the reason now." A second patrol vehicle arrived moments later, its emergency lights adding another layer of flashing color across the quiet roadway. Two officers remained beside their cruiser, observing without interrupting. The atmosphere slowly changed as more passing motorists noticed the growing police presence. Several people stopped on a nearby sidewalk, whispering quietly while watching from a respectful distance. Carter glanced briefly toward the gathering spectators before returning his attention to the driver. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," the man answered almost gently. "I have complied with every instruction you have given." Carter folded his arms. "Then stop asking questions." The man lowered his eyes for a second before looking back up with calm sincerity. "Questions are not acts of resistance, officer. Sometimes they are the beginning of understanding." Carter dismissed the remark and turned toward his patrol vehicle. Without realizing it, he had left the in-car recording system running exactly as department policy required. Inside the cruiser, every word, every pause, every decision, and every change in tone continued to be captured with perfect clarity, while neither man yet understood that the quiet recording would soon become the most important witness at the scene. Officer Ryan Carter looked toward the second patrol unit as two fellow officers quietly took positions several yards away, allowing him to remain in charge of the stop. Their presence strengthened his confidence, but it did nothing to change the calm expression of the man standing beside the silver sedan. The stranger never raised his voice, never stepped out of place, and never once refused an instruction. Instead, he watched everything with remarkable attention, as though every detail mattered. The autumn breeze carried dry leaves across the shoulder of the road, while the last rays of afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the polished hood of the sedan. Carter opened the driver's door and performed a quick visual inspection. The interior surprised him. There were no luxury accessories, no expensive watches lying on the console, no clutter, and no signs of panic. A neatly folded legal brief rested on the passenger seat beside a leather notebook that appeared worn from years of use. A fountain pen sat perfectly aligned across the notebook as though its owner valued order more than appearance. Carter barely glanced at the documents before shutting the door. "You travel light," he remarked. The man smiled politely. "I carry only what I need." Carter crossed his arms. "You seem unusually comfortable for someone in your situation." "Comfort comes from knowing how to remain respectful," the man answered quietly. "Respect usually leads to better conversations." Carter shook his head. "You still believe this is a conversation?" The man nodded gently. Every encounter between two citizens should begin as one. Several people standing near the sidewalk continued watching from a distance. A woman walking her dog slowed to observe before quietly moving farther away. A delivery driver remained inside his truck, looking through the windshield with growing curiosity. None of them could hear every word, yet they all sensed an unusual tension that did not match the peaceful behavior of the man beside the sedan. Carter requested identification once more. The man calmly handed over his driver's license without hesitation. Carter studied it for only a moment before slipping it into his pocket instead of returning it. "Wait here," he instructed. The man gave a respectful nod. "May I ask whether I am being detained or free to leave?" Carter answered without looking back. "You are staying exactly where you are until I decide otherwise." The man accepted the response with remarkable composure. "Very well." Carter walked toward his patrol vehicle, convinced he remained completely in control of the situation. As he opened the driver's door, the dashboard computer illuminated with a reminder that the in-car recording system was active and securely saving every second of audio. Carter dismissed the notification without reading it carefully. Behind him, the man quietly looked toward the fading sky before whispering almost to himself. Sometimes the truth only needs time to be heard. Officer Ryan Carter settled into the driver's seat of his patrol vehicle and placed the driver's license beside the keyboard mounted near the dashboard. The computer screen displayed routine information while the recording indicator continued blinking quietly in the corner, capturing every sound inside and outside the cruiser. Carter barely noticed it. His attention remained fixed on the silver sedan parked several yards ahead and the man who continued standing beside it with remarkable patience. Most people became anxious after only a few minutes during a roadside stop. They paced, argued, searched for explanations, or repeatedly asked when they could leave. This man did none of those things. Instead, he simply watched the evening light settle across the road as though time itself no longer concerned him. Carter found the silence strangely unsettling. He stepped back outside and walked toward the sedan once more. "You seem awfully calm," he said. The man smiled politely. "Being calm helps people hear each other." Carter shook his head. "That depends on whether they have something worth saying." The man looked directly at him without the slightest hint of resentment. "Everyone has something worth saying. The difficult part is deciding whether we are willing to listen." One of the assisting officers quietly approached Carter and lowered his voice. "Everything all right?" Carter nodded confidently. "He keeps trying to turn this into a legal debate." The assisting officer glanced toward the man standing beside the sedan. "He has been cooperative the entire time." Carter answered without hesitation. Cooperative people answer questions. They do not question every instruction. The conversation drifted across the quiet roadway and into the open microphones mounted inside the patrol vehicles. Every sentence was preserved with perfect clarity, unnoticed by everyone present. Nearby, the small crowd continued to grow. A retired couple returning from grocery shopping paused beside the sidewalk. A bicyclist stopped several yards away. Even the woman walking her dog remained nearby, sensing that the encounter had become less about traffic enforcement and more about two very different ideas of authority. The man finally spoke again. "Officer, I would appreciate the return of my identification unless there is a lawful reason to keep it." Carter folded his arms. "You will receive it when I am finished." The man nodded respectfully. "Then may I ask whether I am under arrest?" Carter answered almost immediately. "You are now being detained pending further investigation." The man never resisted the statement. Instead, he quietly lowered his eyes before speaking with measured sincerity. "Very well. I will continue to cooperate completely. I only hope that every decision made today is supported by the same facts that will be reviewed tomorrow." Carter dismissed the remark with a confident wave of his hand, unaware that those final words settled into the patrol car's digital recording alongside every instruction, every response, and every silence that had unfolded since the flashing lights first appeared behind the silver sedan. The evening sky slowly shifted from bright blue to shades of amber as traffic continued flowing around the growing line of patrol vehicles parked along the shoulder. Officer Ryan Carter stood beside the silver sedan, convinced that every decision he had made was justified. The man before him remained as composed as ever, his hands relaxed at his sides, his attention never drifting far from the officer speaking to him. There was no anger in his face, no attempt to argue, and no sign of fear. Instead, there was only quiet patience, as though he understood that moments of pressure often revealed far more than moments of comfort. Carter took a slow breath before speaking again. "You have had every opportunity to cooperate." The man answered politely. "Officer, I have cooperated from the beginning. Carter frowned. You keep questioning my authority. The man gently shook his head. I have only asked you to explain it. Those words lingered in the cool afternoon air. One of the assisting officers glanced toward Carter, but chose not to interrupt. The atmosphere around the roadside had changed. Even the small group of bystanders seemed unusually quiet, watching less out of curiosity and more because they sensed that something important was unfolding. Carter stepped toward the patrol vehicle and opened the rear passenger door. Please take a seat inside. Without hesitation, the man nodded respectfully and complied exactly as instructed. Before entering the cruiser, he paused briefly and looked toward Carter. May I ask one final question? Carter answered with visible impatience. Make it quick. The man spoke calmly. Would you please state for the recording the legal reasons supporting this detention? Carter exhaled sharply. I have already explained everything that matters. The man lowered his head slightly before entering the patrol vehicle without another word. The rear door closed with a soft click that echoed across the quiet roadside. Inside the cruiser, the digital recording system continued preserving every sound with flawless precision. The man sat upright, looking peacefully through the window at the fading sunlight stretching across the trees lining the highway. Outside, Carter returned to the driver's seat and began entering notes into the onboard computer. Before he finished the first sentence, the radio crackled with an incoming transmission from dispatch requesting routine confirmation of the stop. Carter answered confidently while the recording system captured every response. Several miles away, inside the communications center, the stop appeared no different from hundreds of others taking place that afternoon. Yet somewhere within the department's automated evidence system, a secure digital file had already begun storing every spoken word, every unanswered legal question, every pause, and every decision exactly as they occurred, creating an objective record that neither opinion nor memory would ever be able to change once the truth was finally called upon to speak. The patrol vehicle pulled away from the roadside with quiet determination, merging into the steady flow of evening traffic as the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. Inside the rear seat, the man remained perfectly still, his eyes following the passing neighborhoods through the window without the slightest sign of frustration. The silence inside the cruiser felt almost unusual. Officer Ryan Carter expected complaints, demands, or attempts to argue. Instead, he heard nothing except the low hum of the engine and the steady operation of the recording system mounted above the windshield. After several minutes, Carter glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. You have been unusually quiet. The man answered with the same calm voice that had never changed since the traffic stop began. Silence gives people an opportunity to think. Carter looked back toward the road. You should probably be thinking about explaining yourself. The man smiled faintly. I have been explaining myself since we first met. The question is whether anyone has been listening. Those words settled inside the cruiser with remarkable weight. Every syllable continued to be preserved by the digital recording system operating exactly as designed. When the patrol vehicle arrived at the local station, routine procedures continued without urgency. Officers moved through the building carrying paperwork, answering radios, and greeting one another after long shifts. Nothing about the evening suggested that an extraordinary case had just entered the system. The man waited patiently in a quiet interview room with a small table, 2 chairs, and a large window overlooking the parking lot where the fading daylight reflected across rows of patrol vehicles. He neither complained nor requested special treatment. He simply folded his hands together and quietly observed the room around him. Meanwhile, Officer Carter began completing the required incident report. As he entered each detail into the department database, several fields required him to describe the legal basis supporting his decisions. He paused longer than expected before continuing. Across the hallway, a supervising lieutenant reviewed newly uploaded digital evidence from routine patrol activity. The software automatically transferred audio from every completed vehicle recording into the department archive without requiring officer approval. One file appeared with an unusually long duration, prompting the lieutenant to begin listening while organizing the evening reports. At first, everything sounded ordinary. Greetings. Routine questions. Calm responses. Then another voice asked a simple legal question with remarkable courtesy. The lieutenant stopped typing and replayed the exchange. He listened again, this time paying closer attention to every response. Outside the office window, darkness settled across the station parking lot while fluorescent lights illuminated the nearly empty hallway. Inside the archive system, the audio continued exactly as it had happened, untouched by memory, opinion, or emotion. For the first time that evening, someone who had not been present at the roadside encounter was hearing the entire conversation exactly as it had unfolded, and with every passing minute, the quiet certainty surrounding the incident began to change. The hallway outside the interview room remained unusually quiet as the evening shift settled into its routine rhythm. Fluorescent lights reflected across polished tile floors while distant conversations faded behind closed office doors. Inside the small room, the man sat exactly where he had been left, his hands resting comfortably on the table as he watched the soft glow of parking lot lights appear beyond the window. Time seemed to move differently around him. He neither checked the clock nor asked when someone would return. He simply waited with the calm confidence of someone who understood that truth rarely needed to hurry. Across the building, the supervising lieutenant removed his headphones after listening to the recording for a third time. He leaned back slowly, staring at the computer monitor without touching the keyboard. Every exchange had been remarkably polite. Every legal question had been asked respectfully. Every response from the roadside had been preserved with unmistakable clarity. The lieutenant reopened the recording and carefully compared the audio with the preliminary incident report that Officer Ryan Carter had just submitted. Small differences began appearing one after another. Certain statements included in the report could not be heard on the recording. Other moments that clearly existed in the audio had been omitted entirely. The lieutenant quietly reached for the office telephone before stopping himself. Instead, he stood and walked toward the evidence division carrying a printed copy of the report. Meanwhile, Carter sat alone at his desk finishing routine paperwork. He looked tired but satisfied, believing another difficult traffic stop had finally come to an end. He noticed several supervisors walking through the hallway with unusually serious expressions, yet none of them spoke to him. That silence unsettled him more than any criticism could have. Back inside the interview room, a staff member placed a cup of coffee on the table. The man smiled warmly. "Thank you." The employee hesitated before asking, "Is there anything else you need, sir?" He gently shook his head. "Only patience." The answer lingered long after the employee quietly closed the door. Outside, rain began falling lightly across the station parking lot, covering the pavement with shimmering reflections from the streetlights. The gentle sound of rainfall blended with the low hum of the building's ventilation system, creating a rare moment of stillness that seemed to pause the entire evening. Nearly an hour after the roadside stop had ended, the lieutenant finally reached a secure personnel database to complete a routine identity verification connected to the driver's license entered into the system. As the official profile appeared on the screen, his expression changed instantly. He read the title once, then again, before slowly removing his glasses. Without saying a single word, he picked up the printed report, the digital recording reference, and walked directly toward the chief command office, realizing that the most important part of the evening had only just begun. The chief command office remained silent as the supervising lieutenant placed the printed report beside the computer monitor and started the audio recording from the beginning. No one interrupted. The only sound inside the room came from the calm voices preserved by the patrol vehicle's recording system. Every respectful question asked beside the quiet roadside returned exactly as it had happened. Every answer given by Officer Ryan Carter followed without interruption. There was no confusion, no missing context, and no emotional exaggeration. The recording spoke with complete neutrality, allowing the facts to stand entirely on their own. As the final exchange ended, the room remained still for several long seconds. The chief slowly turned toward the identity profile displayed on the monitor. The official record confirmed that the man waiting quietly inside the interview room was Judge Nathaniel Brooks, a respected federal district judge with decades of judicial service and an extraordinary professional reputation. Yet the title itself was not what immediately concerned the command staff. It was the realization that the audio revealed a series of legal questions asked politely, reasonable requests for clarification, and a level of cooperation that sharply contrasted with the assumptions contained in the incident report. The chief folded his hands and spoke quietly. This is no longer about who he is. This is about whether our own procedures were followed. The lieutenant nodded. The recording answers that question more clearly than any witness could. Across the hallway, Officer Ryan Carter noticed several supervisors walking toward the interview room together. Their expressions carried neither anger nor urgency, only the calm seriousness reserved for moments requiring careful judgment. Carter instinctively stood from his desk. Is something wrong? The chief looked at him briefly before answering. We are reviewing the recording. Carter attempted a confident smile. It will confirm exactly what happened. The chief replied with measured professionalism. That is precisely why we are listening to it. Inside the interview room, Judge Nathaniel Brooks quietly rose to his feet as the door opened. The chief entered first and offered a respectful handshake. Judge Brooks, thank you for your patience. Nathaniel accepted the gesture with quiet dignity. Patience often gives the truth enough time to arrive. The chief nodded slowly. We have completed our initial review of the recording. Nathaniel never asked what conclusion had been reached. He simply waited. After a brief pause, the chief continued. The audio confirms that your conduct remained respectful throughout the encounter and that several important procedural questions now require formal review. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back up. Then the recording has done exactly what I hoped it would do. The chief appeared surprised. You expected this outcome? Nathaniel answered with the same calm voice that had never changed since the flashing lights first appeared behind his sedan. I expected only that the truth, once preserved, without opinion, would eventually speak more clearly than either of us ever could. The rain had stopped by the time Judge Nathaniel Brooks stepped out of the interview room, leaving the station parking lot covered in shimmering reflections beneath the streetlights. No reporters waited outside. No cameras captured the moment. The building had grown unusually quiet, as though everyone inside understood that the evening no longer belonged to assumptions but to facts. The chief walked beside Nathaniel through the hallway with measured respect before stopping near the front entrance. Judge Brooks, he began carefully. On behalf of this department, I apologize for what occurred tonight. Nathaniel looked at the chief with the same calm expression he had carried since the roadside stop began. I appreciate your words, he replied softly. But what matters most is what happens after tonight. The chief nodded. A complete procedural review has already been initiated. Nathaniel smiled gently. Then the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Across the room, Officer Ryan Carter stood silently beside his desk, watching the conversation from a distance. The confidence that had filled his posture only hours earlier had disappeared. He did not interrupt. He did not attempt to defend himself. He simply listened. After a long moment, he slowly approached Nathaniel and stopped several feet away. Judge Brooks, he said quietly, I made decisions before I fully understood the situation. I believed I was protecting the law, but I forgot that the law also requires patience. Nathaniel studied him for a moment before answering. Every person entrusted with authority faces that temptation at some point. Carter lowered his eyes. I cannot change what happened. Nathaniel gently shook his head. None of us can. The only thing we truly control is what we choose after we recognize our mistakes. Those words settled over the hallway with remarkable stillness. The chief and several supervisors remained silent, allowing the conversation to continue without interruption. Carter drew a slow breath. I expected anger from you. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Anger rarely teaches what humility can. Carter looked genuinely surprised. You are not asking for anything? Nathaniel answered without hesitation. Only that every future encounter begins with the same respect every citizen deserves, regardless of appearance, occupation, or circumstance. If the law protects only certain people, then it eventually protects no one. The chief quietly nodded, recognizing the weight carried by those simple words. Nathaniel accepted the return of his driver's license, placed it carefully inside his wallet, and thanked the officer at the front desk who opened the station door. Before stepping outside, he paused briefly and turned back toward the hallway one final time. The recording did not defeat anyone tonight, he said calmly. It simply reminded all of us that the truth does not need the loudest voice. It only needs the chance to be heard. No one answered. No one needed to. The silence itself carried more meaning than any argument ever could. The first light of morning spread across the marble steps of the federal courthouse in Washington, District of Columbia, washing the stone in warm shades of gold as the city quietly awakened. Judge Nathaniel Brooks walked toward the entrance carrying the same worn leather notebook that had rested inside his silver sedan the evening before. His pace was steady, his expression peaceful, and there was nothing about his appearance that suggested he had become the center of an extraordinary event only hours earlier. Court employees greeted him with quiet respect as he returned each smile with the same kindness he offered every morning. Across town, Officer Ryan Carter sat alone inside a classroom at the Police Training Academy where experienced instructors reviewed constitutional procedures, professional ethics, and the responsibility carried by every badge. The lesson was familiar, yet it felt entirely different now. Carter listened more carefully than he ever had before. Every discussion about authority reminded him that authority existed to serve the law, never to replace it. Days later, the department completed its formal review using the preserved recording, written reports, and routine administrative procedures. The conclusions rested upon objective evidence rather than assumptions, exactly as Judge Brooks had hoped. No public celebration followed. No dramatic headlines appeared. The process simply worked as it was designed to work when people allowed facts to lead the way. Several weeks later, Carter returned to patrol. During his first traffic stop after completing additional training, he approached an aging pickup truck where an elderly driver appeared nervous while searching for registration papers. Carter smiled gently before speaking. "Take your time, sir. There is no rush." The driver's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. For the first time in many years, Carter understood that patience often protected both dignity and trust before any legal question ever needed an answer. On another quiet morning, Judge Brooks happened to drive through the same neighborhood where the original roadside stop had taken place. The maple trees still lined the shoulder, their leaves now glowing with deeper autumn colors beneath a clear blue sky. He slowed briefly as he passed the familiar stretch of road, then continued toward the courthouse without stopping. There was nothing left to prove. The recording had preserved the truth. The review had honored the truth. Now the future belonged to the choices people made because of the truth. Somewhere nearby, a patrol vehicle continued its daily route beneath the same open sky, carrying an officer who had learned that respect should always arrive before suspicion. Judge Brooks entered the courthouse as morning sunlight filled the grand hallway beyond the doors. Outside, the breeze carried a few golden leaves across the quiet sidewalk before they settled gently against the stone steps. Sometimes justice speaks inside a courtroom. Sometimes it speaks through a simple recording that refuses to forget. And sometimes its greatest victory is not changing a verdict, but quietly changing the hearts of the people entrusted to uphold the law.